On Mother's Day, my own son stood up in front of 32 guests, raised a glass of Prosecco toward me, smiled the way he used to smile when he was 6 years old and proud of a drawing he'd made, and said, "Let's be honest. You're dead to me, Mum." The garden went quiet so fast I could hear the wind chimes on the pergola. My daughter-in-law's fork froze halfway to her mouth. My youngest grandson, who was 4, looked up from his coloring book because he understood, in the way small children always do, that something had gone very wrong even if he didn't know what. Somewhere near the hedge, a blackbird kept singing, completely indifferent to the fact that my entire world had just cracked down the middle. I looked at my son. Really looked at him. He was 39 years old, wearing the navy blazer I'd bought him for his father's funeral 3 years earlier, and he was waiting. Waiting for me to cry. Waiting for me to shout. Waiting for me to become the villain in whatever story he'd been rehearsing in his head for months. Instead, I put down my napkin, folded it neatly beside my plate, and stood up. "Then you'd better learn to live," I said quietly, as if you never had one. I picked up my handbag, walked past 32 stunned faces, past the Victoria sponge I'd baked at 5 that morning, past the banner his daughter had made that said "World's Best Nan," and I walked out to the driveway. I got into the car parked beside the roses, the car that everyone at that party, including my son, assumed belonged to him, and I drove away. 11 minutes later, stopped at the lights on the Wilmslow Road. My phone buzzed. "Mum, bring the car back or I'm calling the police." I actually laughed out loud, alone in the driver's seat, because after everything I had given that boy, he genuinely believed a car with my name on every single document still somehow belonged to him. It didn't. It never had. My name is Margaret Whitfield. I am 61 years old. I am a widow. I built a small catering business from a rented kitchen in Stockport into something that now feeds half of Greater Manchester's weddings, and until that Sunday afternoon, if you had asked me what I was proudest of in my whole life, I wouldn't have said the business. I would have said my son. I would have told you that raising Oliver was the finest thing I ever did. It turns out I was wrong about at least one of those two things. I didn't answer his text. I kept driving, past the retail park, past the church where his father and I were married 40 years earlier, until I reached the little car park at the edge of Lime Park, where you can see the whole valley laid out beneath you like something out of a postcard. I switched off the engine and sat there in the silence. For the first time all day, the quiet felt honest. Memories have a strange habit of arriving exactly when your heart finally stops pretending everything is fine. I remembered the one-bedroom flat above the chip shop where Oliver's father and I lived in the first year of our marriage. We didn't have money then. We had determination and very little else. I worked mornings in a school kitchen and evenings baking for anyone in the neighborhood who'd pay me for a birthday cake. Derek, my husband, drove a delivery van 6 days a week. There were years we counted out coins on the kitchen table to see whether we could afford the electricity meter. Derek used to tease me. One day, he'd say, "You'll have your own kitchen, your own vans, your own staff." I used to laugh and tell him I'd settle for paying off the cooker. Somehow, over 32 years, we managed both. Whitfield's kitchen grew from one woman baking in a rented unit into a catering company with 41 staff, 3 vans, and a waiting list for wedding bookings that stretched 18 months. We never became some enormous national chain. We became something better. A company brides trusted with the most important day of their lives, the kind of company where staff stayed for 15 years because I remembered their children's birthdays, the kind where mothers who'd used us for their own weddings came back 20 years later for their daughters. It didn't happen overnight. It happened one order, one contract, one 3 a.m. finish for a Saturday wedding at a time. And through all of it, there was Oliver. Because Derek and I remembered exactly what it felt like to count coins on a kitchen table, we promised each other our son would never have to. We paid for football camps and guitar lessons and a second-hand Fiesta when he passed his test. We paid for university outright so he'd graduate with no debt at all. When he wanted to start his own marketing consultancy after his master's, I quietly guaranteed the business loan at the bank. When the consultancy nearly folded in its second year, I paid off the shortfall without telling a single soul, including his father. When he married Chloe, I paid for most of the wedding because I wanted the two of them to start their marriage without owing anyone a penny. I never once kept score. Parents aren't supposed to. That's what I believed, right up until the moment I learned that some debts are never repaid, only excused, and every excuse teaches the other person exactly how far they can push. After Derek died of a heart attack 4 years ago, helping Oliver became my way of staying close to him. Derek always said family came first, above everything. Now I sometimes wonder whether I misunderstood what he meant. Family comes before pride. It should never come before honesty. Looking back now, from the quiet of that car park with the whole valley spread out below me, I could see all the small moments I'd chosen to ignore, one after another, like stepping stones leading to that Mother's Day table. If Oliver brought friends round to my cottage in the Peak District, he'd call it our little place in the country. Within a year, it had quietly become my place. When someone at his tennis club admired the car parked outside the clubhouse, he'd say, "Yeah, I've always wanted a Range Rover." He never once claimed outright that he'd bought it. He simply never corrected anyone who assumed he had. I heard it myself, once, at his golf club dinner. A man clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Must be nice, that car of yours." Oliver smiled and said, "Can't complain." I was standing 4 feet away. He never once looked over at me. I should have spoken up right then. Instead, I told myself it wasn't worth the embarrassment, not in front of his friends. That excuse became a habit, and habits, I've learned, are just decisions we've stopped noticing we're making. The car itself had a simple story. I bought it 2 years after Derek passed, as a gift to myself, because I'd spent 30 years driving whatever van had the least mileage on the clock, and Derek always said, "One day, love, you'll drive something with leather seats and no logo on the door." He never lived to see me sign the paperwork. I cried in the dealership car park, not because of the car, but because he wasn't there in the passenger seat to see it. A few months later, Oliver asked to borrow it for a work conference. Of course, I said yes. Then it was a wedding. Then it was just for the weekend. Eventually, it was simply easier to leave it parked outside his house, because he asked so often it felt rude to refuse. The registration, the insurance, every service record, all of it stayed in my name. There was never a single conversation about signing it over, because I never once intended to. It was still mine. It always had been. Somewhere along the way, Oliver had rewritten that story inside his own head. Or perhaps Chloe helped him rewrite it. She had a particular gift for making temporary arrangements sound permanent. "It'll all be yours one day anyway," I once overheard her tell him when she thought I wasn't listening. Harmless words until they weren't. My phone buzzed again on the passenger seat. Final warning. I'm reporting it stolen. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then turned it face down. If my son genuinely believed his own mother had stolen her own car, he was about to learn that reality does not bend itself politely around entitlement. 10 minutes later, the phone rang. Greater Manchester Police. "Mrs. Whitfield?" "Speaking. We've had a report of a vehicle taken this afternoon. Your Range Rover." I closed my eyes. Mother's Day, it seemed, was only just beginning. The officer's voice was calm, unhurried, the voice of a man who had clearly done this exact call 100 times before and had learned not to take sides until he had to. "May I ask who filed the report?" I said, though I already knew the answer sitting heavy in my chest. "Your son. A Mr. Oliver Whitfield." I looked out through the windscreen at the valley below, the fields turning gold in the early evening light, and said nothing for a moment. "Mrs. Whitfield? Are you still there?" "I'm here. And yes, I have the car." "Do you have proof of ownership?" "I have more than proof. I have the original invoice, the logbook, the insurance certificate, and every single service record since the day I bought it." There was a pause on the line, the sound of a pen clicking. "You bought it yourself?" "Yes." Another pause. "I'm sorry to have troubled you, Mrs. Whitfield." The reporting party was quite insistent it belonged to him. "It doesn't. If you're willing, could you email through copies of the logbook and insurance? Save us all a wasted visit." "I'll send them within the hour." Before he rang off, the officer said something that stayed with me for weeks afterwards. "I've dealt with a fair few of these family disputes over the years. They're never really about the vehicle." "No," I said quietly. They almost never are. 20 minutes later I was sitting in a small cafe near Disley, a pot of tea going cold in front of me, forwarding scanned documents to a police email address from my phone. The logbook listed one keeper. No co-owner, no finance agreement, no note of any kind. Just my name, printed in black and white. I stared at it far longer than I needed to. Extraordinary, how much truth can fit onto a single sheet of paper. My phone buzzed again. Oliver calling this time. I let it ring out. Then again. Then a voicemail. Mom, this isn't funny anymore. Bring the car back before you make this worse. Worse. I nearly smiled at that word. He still genuinely believed I was the unreasonable one in all of this. About 15 minutes later, my solicitor rang. Richard Aldous and I had known each other for almost 25 years. He'd handled every contract Whitfield's kitchen had ever signed, every lease, every insurance dispute, and Derek's estate when he passed. You sound exhausted, Richard said. I've had an interesting Mother's Day. So I gather. Greater Manchester Police rang my office an hour ago to confirm the ownership records, since you'd listed me as your solicitor of record on the vehicle file. I laughed despite myself. So now my solicitor knows my son reported me for stealing my own car. I'm afraid so. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then Richard said, gently, Margaret, I think we've reached the point where looking the other way isn't helping anyone. Least of all Oliver. I know. I think I've been expecting this call for a long time. That surprised him. You have. You've spent 3 years telling me not to say anything every time Oliver crossed another line. You weren't wrong to worry. There have been plenty of lines. I just kept quietly erasing them. The very first should have been enough on its own. 4 years earlier, Oliver had invited me to a charity dinner at a hotel outside Alderley Edge. I remember standing beside him while he introduced me to a property developer he was hoping to sign as a client. This is my mum, he said, and for a moment I felt proud, until the developer glanced past me toward the car park and admired the Range Rover parked near the entrance. Lovely motor, that. Cheers, Oliver said. Just that. One word. Not, it's my mother's. Just cheers, and the conversation moved on before I could say anything at all. Later that night I mentioned it in the car. You forgot to tell him whose car that was. He laughed. Mum, does it really matter? It's not about the car. Exactly, I said. It isn't. But he hugged me before I got out and said, knew you'd understand, and because I wanted peace more than I wanted the truth, I let it go. Then came the cottage. Derek and I had bought a small stone cottage near Edale years before he died. Nothing grand, just somewhere quiet to escape to on weekends, walk the dog, watch the weather roll over the hills. After he passed I visited less, and Oliver's family began using it more. I was glad at first, until one Saturday I arrived unannounced with shopping bags and heard him through the open kitchen window, talking to a couple of friends. You should see it up here at Christmas. Basically our second home. Not Mum's. Ours. Chloe added, from somewhere inside, we're thinking of doing the kitchen up once everything's official. Official. I stepped through the back door. Everyone smiled at me. Nobody explained a word of it. On the drive home I told myself she'd simply misspoken. Looking back now, she hadn't misspoken at all. She'd simply said out loud how they already saw their future, not as something uncertain, but as something they already owned. The clearest warning of all came almost 18 months ago, at Whitfield's Kitchen's 30th anniversary staff party. Toward the end of the evening, one of my longest-serving chefs congratulated Oliver. Must feel good, knowing you'll be taking the reins one day. Before I could say a single word, Oliver simply nodded. Looking forward to putting my own stamp on things. His own stamp. I watched 3 of my most loyal staff members exchange a quiet glance across the marquee. Some looked confused. Some looked uneasy. Because they knew something Oliver, apparently, did not. I had never once promised him the company. I'd always assumed we'd discuss succession properly, when the time was right, with a plan, with conditions. He had assumed it was already his by default. That realization sat in my chest like a stone all the way home. And still, I said nothing. Margaret, Richard said gently on the phone, pulling me back into the present. You've gone quiet. I was remembering all the moments I should have spoken up and didn't. You can't undo those. No, I said. But I can stop making new ones. He let out a breath, relieved. I was hoping you'd say exactly that. That evening I drove home. The bunting was gone from the garden. The catering trailer had left. Only a few deflated balloons remained tied to the gate, drifting lazily in the breeze. Inside, everything sat exactly as it always had, Derek's reading glasses on the side table, the quilt his mother had stitched, the piano nobody played anymore. I walked into the little study we'd always called the office, unlocked the fireproof cabinet, and lifted out the thick folder marked Will and Estate. Derek and I had written most of it together, back when we imagined growing old surrounded by grateful grandchildren, back before either of us had ever heard the word entitlement used about our own family. I turned the pages slowly. Everything, every last thing, flowed to Oliver. The business. The cottage. The savings. Generous, because I believed generosity built stronger families. Perhaps, instead, it had quietly built something else. The absence of responsibility. The phone rang again. Richard. I've been thinking, he said. Dangerous habit. He laughed softly. I've an opening tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. I think it's time we go through that estate plan, page by page. I looked down at the folder resting under my hand. For years I had treated it like a promise carved in stone. Perhaps it was time to start treating it like a responsibility instead. I'll be there, I said. 9 o'clock. I won't be late. Outside, the sky over the valley was turning a deep, burnt orange. Inside the house, something else was quietly turning too. At 9 o'clock precisely on Monday morning, I walked into Richard's office in Wilmslow carrying a leather folder that suddenly felt heavier than it had any right to feel. Not because of the paper inside it, but because every single page represented a promise made years earlier to a husband who wasn't here anymore, to a son who no longer seemed to know me, and to a future I had once believed my family would share honestly. Richard stood as I came in. We'd known each other far too long for small talk. Did you sleep at all? A couple of hours. Tea. I've already had 3 cups. He gestured toward the small conference table. Then let's begin. For 25 years I had sat in that same office signing supplier contracts, lease renewals, insurance policies for Whitfield's kitchen. I had never once imagined I would be sitting there deciding whether my own son deserved to inherit the company I'd spent 3 decades building with my own 2 hands. Richard opened my file. Before we change anything, he said, I need to ask you one question, and I need an honest answer. Go on. Are you doing this out of anger? I thought about it properly before I answered, because the question deserved honesty and nothing less. If I were doing this out of anger, I said finally, I'd cut him out of everything completely. And is that what you're planning? No. Richard leaned back in his chair. Then why are we here? I looked past him, out through the window, down toward the high street where people were hurrying past with shopping bags, ordinary life carrying on exactly as it always does. I think, I said slowly, I've spent years confusing love with rescuing him. He didn't interrupt. Every time I quietly paid off a debt he didn't know I'd noticed. Every time I overlooked the arrogance or the little lies of omission, or stayed silent instead of correcting him in front of other people, I called all of it love. I paused. I don't think it was love at all. I think it was fear. Fear of what? That if I ever stopped fixing things for him, he'd stop loving me back. The words surprised even me, hanging there in the quiet office. I had never once said them out loud before, not even to myself. Richard gave me a sad, understanding sort of smile. Margaret, that's a fear an awful lot of parents carry. More than you'd think. I know. But I also know Derek would have called me stubborn for waiting this long. He laughed gently. He probably would have, yes. We spent the next 3 hours going through every section of the estate plan, line by line. The first document concerned Whitfield's kitchen itself. Richard slid the page toward me. As it currently stands, controlling ownership transfers directly and entirely to Oliver. I stared at the words. For years I had never once questioned that clause. Back when Oliver was 26, hungry, hard-working, genuinely grateful for every opportunity, it had seemed the obvious, natural thing to do. That young man still existed somewhere underneath everything. I hoped, quietly, that he did. But the man who had stood up at his own Mother's Day lunch and toasted her as dead to him wasn't ready to be responsible for 41 families whose mortgages and school fees depended on that business surviving. I want to change it, I said. To what? An employee ownership trust. Richard raised an eyebrow. You're serious about this? I am. Whitfield's kitchen was never built by me alone. It was built by chefs who worked 6 a.m. starts on Christmas morning for other people's turkeys. Drivers who navigated the M60 at midnight after a wedding ran late. Staff who stayed through the lean years instead of chasing a better wage elsewhere. Those people deserve security, not uncertainty tied to one man's temperament. We'll structure it properly, Richard said, making notes. Oliver can still work there if he earns his place like anyone else. That sounds, Richard said with a faint smile, like your first proper boundary. It probably is. Next came the cottage near Edale. Derek had loved that place more than almost anywhere else on earth. Our grandchildren had learned to skim stones on the little stream behind it. Every New Year we'd gathered around that same stone fireplace. Richard glanced up. Keeping it in the family, I assume? I thought for a long moment. Then I shook my head. No. I want it donated. To whom? A veterans charity. There's one near Buxton that helps ex-servicemen and women adjust to civilian life. Derek volunteered with them for years before he got too ill to manage it. He always said that cottage would make the perfect quiet retreat for someone who needed it. We simply never got round to arranging it. Richard wrote it down. I think he'd have approved. So do I. The savings and investment accounts came next. Rather than passing everything straight to Oliver, I established a scholarship foundation in Derek's name for young people entering skilled trades and hospitality apprenticeships, chefs, drivers, event managers, the sort of people who build things with their hands and rarely get thanked properly for it. Richard looked up from his notes. This is quite a significant change, Margaret. I'm not taking anything away from my son. No, he agreed. You're putting purpose ahead of entitlement. That's exactly it. When we finally finished, close to midday, Richard took off his glasses. One last question. Go on. If Oliver genuinely changes years from now, can any of this be altered again? Without a moment's hesitation, I said. Yes. He looked visibly relieved. So this isn't revenge. I allowed myself a small, tired smile. No. This is accountability. That afternoon I drove home feeling strangely, unexpectedly peaceful. Not victorious. Not happy exactly. Just lighter, as though I'd finally set down something I'd been carrying for years without realizing how heavy it had become. When I pulled into my own driveway, another car was already parked there. Chloe's little hatchback. Beside it, no sign of the Range Rover because of course there wasn't. I was still driving it myself. As I stepped out, the front door swung open before I'd even reached it, and Oliver came storming out onto the drive. There you are. His face was flushed, his jaw tight in a way I hadn't seen since he was a teenager arguing about a curfew. You've made me look like an absolute idiot in front of the police. I didn't ring the police, Oliver. You knew exactly what would happen. I knew, I said quietly, that the truth would happen. Chloe appeared in the doorway behind him, arms folded tightly across her chest. This whole thing is completely childish, Margaret. I looked at her calmly. Reporting someone for stealing their own property is childish. I agree completely. She rolled her eyes. You know what I mean. No, I said. I really don't think I do. Oliver stepped closer, his voice dropping into something almost pleading. Just sign the logbook over to me. Please. The words hung there in the cold afternoon air. I actually blinked at him, genuinely startled. Sign it over? Oliver, you've been borrowing that car for 2 years. Same difference. No, I said. It really isn't. He laughed, a short, bitter sound. You've always treated it like it was mine anyway. I let you use it. You left it parked at our house half the time. Because I trusted you, I said. That isn't the same as giving it to you. I turned and walked past him into the house. Both of them followed close on my heels. In the study, I unlocked the fireproof cabinet again and lifted out a thin folder. Without a single word, I laid the papers out on the dining table. The original invoice, the logbook, the insurance certificate. Every document carried exactly one name. Chloe picked one up, and I watched the confidence slowly drain out of her face as she read it. This is really in your name. It always has been. There has to be something else, Oliver insisted, flicking through the papers as though a different version might magically appear underneath. There has to be. There isn't. He finally looked up at me. So you've been lying to me this whole time? I could barely believe what I was hearing. Lying? Oliver, I let you borrow my car. I never once told you it was yours. You just... His voice trailed off. You assumed, I said gently. There's a difference, and I think you know it. The room went completely silent. Chloe broke it first. So what happens now? I slid the documents carefully back into the folder. Now, I said, closing the cabinet, I think we're finished discussing the car. You can't seriously be ending things between us over a car, Mum. I turned slowly to face him. This stopped being about the car the moment you stood up in front of your own children and toasted me as dead to you. For the first time since Mother's Day, my son had absolutely no answer at all. After they left, the house fell into a painful sort of quiet. I walked out into the back garden, where we'd been celebrating only 2 days earlier. The banner his daughter had made still hung crookedly from the pergola, one corner flapping gently in the breeze. World's Best Nan. I stood looking at it for a long time. The irony would have been almost funny if it hadn't hurt quite so much. Eventually I climbed onto a garden chair and carefully took it down, folding it as gently as I could, remembering my granddaughter's small proud face when she'd handed it to me. Children never understand the battles adults quietly build around them. I hope, with everything in me, that they never have to. Wednesday morning, I arrived at Whitfield's kitchen before 6, as I still do most weeks, retired or not. The smell of proving dough and industrial ovens has always felt more like home to me than my own kitchen. Staff greeted me as I walked through. Morning, Mrs. Whitfield. Lovely to see you. Nothing seemed unusual until I reached my old office. Derek's photograph still sat exactly where I'd always kept it. I smiled at it quietly. I've finally stopped pretending everything's fine, I said, out loud, to an empty room. Saying it aloud made me feel closer to him than I had in months. About an hour later, Sandra Ellis, my longtime operations manager, knocked on the open door. Sandra had worked alongside me for 23 years. I'd watched her own children grow up. She'd stood beside me at Derek's funeral. Got a minute? She asked. Always. She stepped inside but didn't sit down. I heard about Sunday. News travels fast in family businesses. I imagined you might have. She hesitated. I wasn't trying to pry, honestly. I know you weren't. Some of the staff have been worried, Margaret. For a while now, actually. That caught my attention properly. Worried about what? Everyone's always assumed Oliver would take over eventually. So did Oliver, I said quietly. Sandra let out a slow breath. I wasn't going to say anything, but some people have been uneasy about it for quite some time. Go on. She chose her words carefully. He doesn't really know the day-to-day of the business. Not properly. And sometimes, he talks as though he already owns the place. I sat back in my chair, absorbing that. Why didn't anyone say anything to me sooner? Sandra gave me a sad sort of smile. Because nobody wanted to come between a mother and her son. There it was again. The silence. Everyone had been quietly protecting my feelings, exactly as I'd been protecting Oliver's. Together, without ever discussing it, we'd all built a wall around the truth. That afternoon I had 3 separate phone calls from relatives. The first was my younger sister, Pat. I heard you and Oliver had a bit of a falling out. A bit of a falling out, I repeated. Is that what Chloe's calling it? Pat, families say awful things sometimes. I know that. But there isn't really a but after what he said, Pat. Not this time. She went quiet for a moment. I hadn't thought of it quite like that. I've spent years thinking about everyone else's feelings, I said. It's about time I started thinking about my own. The second call came from my cousin Graham, who never once softens an opinion in his life. You've actually changed the locks at the cottage? I have. Trying to punish the lad? No. Because it isn't his cottage, Graham. He chuckled. Fair enough, I suppose. The third call surprised me most of all. It was from Reverend Alice, who'd led our church for almost 15 years. I've spoken with Oliver, she said gently. I thought you might have. He says you're trying to destroy his future. And what do you think? I think, she said, there's usually more than one version of every family story. I appreciate you saying that. There was a brief pause, and then she asked something nobody else had thought to ask. Margaret, have you forgiven him? I looked out through the kitchen window toward the car park. I don't hate my son, I said slowly. I think I forgave him the moment I realized how genuinely lost he'd become. But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences, Alice. It never has. She sounded almost relieved. I was hoping you'd say exactly that. By Friday, something entirely unexpected began happening. The truth started traveling entirely on its own, without any help from me at all. One of the officers who'd handled the vehicle report happened to know a regular customer of the business. That customer mentioned the misunderstanding to another local business owner. Within days, people at the golf club had quietly realized the Range Rover had never belonged to Oliver at all. Someone else mentioned the cottage was mine, always had been. Another pointed out I'd quietly covered his office lease for the first 2 years of his consultancy. Bit by bit, the whole carefully constructed illusion began falling apart. Not because I'd exposed a single word of it. Simply because reality had finally caught up with the story he'd spent years telling everyone, including himself. Late on Saturday afternoon, Chloe arrived at my door, alone. No makeup, no designer coat, nothing at all like the confident woman who'd stood in my dining room a week earlier demanding a logbook. We need to talk, she said. I'm not sure we do. This isn't about the car. Then what is it about? She hesitated. Oliver. I invited her in. She stayed standing. I didn't know the car wasn't his, she said quietly. I honestly believed you'd already signed it over. I never once said that. No, she admitted, looking down. You didn't. I think we both started believing things that were never actually true. I encouraged him. I kept telling him it would all be his eventually. I thought I was motivating him. She let out a bitter little laugh. Maybe I was just feeding something that didn't need feeding. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then she whispered, he hasn't slept properly since Mother's Day. Neither have I admitted. He's blaming everyone at the moment. His father, even for dying when he did. She wiped away a tear. I'm starting to think the only person he should really be blaming is himself. Before she left, she turned back at the door. I don't know if he'll ever admit that out loud. Honestly, I said, neither do I. The following Sunday, my doorbell rang again. This time, when I opened it, Oliver was standing there entirely alone. No Chloe, no anger in his face, no excuses lined up and ready. Just a man who suddenly looked far older than 39. Can I come in? He asked. I stepped aside. You don't need to ask permission to enter your mother's house. He nodded and walked through into the kitchen, where Derek and I had shared thousands of cups of tea across 32 years of marriage. Without being asked, I put the kettle on and made 2 mugs. You still remember how I take it? He said, with a faint smile. 2 sugars. You've never once changed. I've changed plenty of other things. I know. For several minutes we simply sat there in silence. Not an angry silence. The kind of silence that arrives once 2 people finally run out of rehearsed arguments to throw at one another. I'm sorry, he said eventually, barely above a whisper. Which part exactly? He frowned. What do you mean? I've heard people apologize because they got caught, I said. I've also heard people apologize because they've genuinely understood what they've done. Which one is this? He didn't answer straight away. He rubbed both hands over his face slowly. I honestly don't know. That, at least, was the first entirely honest thing he'd said to me in a very long while. I've been angry with you for years, he admitted. I blamed you for absolutely everything. For what exactly? He laughed, bitter and tired. For always managing to succeed at things. No matter what I did, people compared me to you. Your mum built a proper business from nothing. Your mum's so respected around here. Your mum takes care of everybody. I got so tired of hearing it, Mum. So you decided to become me, I said quietly. Or at least, the version of me people saw from the outside. He looked down at the table. I suppose I did. When did that start? I don't know exactly. Maybe after Dad died. Everything changed after that. Mine changed too, I said gently. Losing Derek had hollowed both of us out in entirely different directions. I had buried myself in gratitude for what remained. Oliver had buried himself in resentment for what he felt he'd never quite earned. I kept thinking, he continued, that if people already believed I had everything, they'd stop asking me why I hadn't built anything for myself. Those words landed harder than anything said at that Mother's Day table. Not because they excused a single thing. Because, finally, they explained it. You remember the charity dinner? He said. When that developer admired the car. I do. I let him think it was mine. You did. I wanted him to think I was already successful. Were you? He gave me a sad, small smile. No. I was pretending. Every single year it got a little bit easier. The cottage, the car, the business, the golf club. I never actually told anyone a direct lie. I just stopped correcting them. No, I said softly. You just stopped telling the truth. He nodded slowly, eyes filling. Exactly that. I got up and walked to the sideboard, returning with a small wooden box. Inside were decades of scraps, nursery drawings, football medals, holiday photographs, birthday cards. Near the bottom, a folded, faded piece of paper covered in wobbly crayon letters. My mum is my hero. I handed it to him. His hands began to tremble as he unfolded it. I remember making this. You misspelt hero, I said gently. He laughed through sudden tears. You never once corrected me. I knew exactly what you meant. He stared at that little piece of paper for almost a full minute. I don't know where that little boy went, Mum. I don't think he disappeared, I said. I think he simply got buried underneath everything else. He wiped his eyes. Chloe's staying with her sister for a bit. I'm sorry to hear that. We've barely spoken since Sunday. He sighed heavily. She said something that really hurt, actually. What did she say? He swallowed hard. She said she married a man who wanted to inherit a life, instead of building one for himself. I looked at him steadily. Was she wrong? He closed his eyes. No. She wasn't wrong at all. For nearly 2 hours we talked properly, honestly, not as opponents anymore, but as mother and son. He admitted his consultancy was in far worse shape than anyone believed, that he'd borrowed heavily to maintain appearances, the expensive holidays, the golf club membership, the private nursery fees, the designer clothes. Every part of the image he'd worked so hard to project had quietly become another bill he couldn't actually afford. I thought once I inherited everything, he said, I'd finally catch up. That's the trap, love, I said gently. Living tomorrow on money you haven't earned today. I know that now. Did you really change the will? He asked, glancing toward the hallway. I did. His shoulders dropped. I suppose I deserve that. I didn't do it to punish you. I know. I did it because inheritance should never replace character, Oliver. Not ever. He looked up at me. Can it change back? One day. I answered as honestly as I knew how. Yes. Hope flashed across his face, just briefly. When trust changes, I finished. His expression softened. That's fair. It's necessary, I said. Before he left, he stood in the doorway. I don't expect things to just go back to normal. They won't. I don't expect the car. You won't get it. He actually managed a small, genuine smile. Figured as much. I don't expect the business. You may still have a place there, I told him, as a member of staff. Not as an heir. If you earn people's respect properly, the future will take care of itself. He nodded slowly. I think, I'm actually going to have to build something of my own. Your father, I said quietly, would have loved hearing you say that. His eyes filled again. So would I have once? He walked down the driveway without looking back. Not out of anger this time. Because he was thinking. For months afterwards, I heard very little from him. No demands. No late-night arguments. No angry messages. Just quiet. But it was a different kind of quiet than before. It wasn't the silence of pride. It was the silence of someone doing difficult, unglamorous work where nobody else could see it happening. Real change rarely arrives with fireworks. It happens in ordinary mornings, small decisions, long stretches of silence where nobody is watching or applauding. Over those months, Oliver never once mentioned the car again. He never mentioned the will. He never asked whether I'd changed the trust back. Instead, he did something I'd quietly hoped to see for almost 20 years. He went to work. Not for me. For himself. A few weeks after our conversation at the kitchen table, he took an operations role with a regional logistics firm outside Stockport. The salary wasn't glamorous. The benefits were entirely average. For the first time since university, nobody hired him because of my surname. He earned that position through 3 separate interviews and a practical assessment day. When he told me over the phone, I heard something in his voice I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. Real pride. Not borrowed. Earned. I nearly walked out during the second interview, he admitted one evening. Why? I thought they were going to reject me outright. What happened? They asked what I'd built entirely on my own. I told them the truth, that I was still figuring that out. He laughed softly. Honesty tastes different, Mum, after you've spent years pretending. Chloe and Oliver separated for several months. I stayed well out of it. A marriage belongs to the 2 people inside it, not to the parents standing outside the window. One afternoon, Chloe rang and asked if we could have lunch. I agreed. She looked entirely different from the woman who'd once stood in my dining room demanding a signature. There was a real humility in her now. I'm not here to defend myself, she said, once we'd ordered. I've spent a year blaming Oliver for everything. But I wasn't innocent either. I kept pushing him to compete with people who didn't even know we existed. I cared too much about how things looked. We both made mistakes, I said gently. She looked genuinely surprised. You still think you made mistakes? I do. I gave too much and expected gratitude to teach him responsibility on its own. It never was going to. She thought about that for a long moment. Do you honestly think people can really change? I think, I said, people change the moment pretending becomes more painful than telling the truth. She wiped away a tear. I hope you're right about that. Months later, she and Oliver began proper counseling together. It didn't magically fix everything overnight. But they stopped pretending there was nothing left to fix. Sometimes, that's exactly where real healing quietly begins. Meanwhile, Whitfield's kitchen kept growing. The employee ownership trust became fully official. Some people thought I'd made a strange decision. Others said I'd given away far too much. They simply didn't understand. The business had never truly belonged to one woman alone. It belonged to every single person who'd answered an emergency booking on a Saturday morning, every driver who'd navigated black ice at 5 a.m. to get a wedding cake there on time. At our staff Christmas party, I announced the new structure properly. Nobody cheered immediately. Most people simply stared at me. Then Sandra stood up, her voice shaking slightly. I've worked here 23 years. I've never once seen a boss thank her staff quite like this. One by one, the room began applauding. Not for me. For each other. That meant more to me than any award I've ever been handed in my life. About 10 months after that first, terrible Mother's Day, my eldest grandson Jack, now 13, climbed up onto the garden swing beside me one Sunday afternoon. Nan. Yes, love. Dad's different lately. I smiled. He is, He doesn't shout anymore. He sold his flashy watch, you know. I heard. He says we're not rejoining the golf club. How do you feel about that? Jack shrugged. I like fishing better anyway. So did your granddad, I said softly. He looked at me curiously. Dad says you taught him something. What was it? He thought about it for a moment. He said borrowed success disappears. Earned success stays. I looked up at the gray Manchester sky and blinked back tears. I wish, I said quietly, I'd taught him that a good deal sooner. Then Mother's Day came round again. This time, there were no 32 guests, no hired caterers, no expensive banners meant to impress the neighbors. Just sausage rolls, a simple sponge cake, fresh lemonade, and my grandchildren running through the garden with the hose. Exactly the sort of afternoon Derek would have loved most. Around midday, an old blue Ford pulled into the driveway. Not new. Not polished. Just clean, and clearly well cared for. Oliver climbed out wearing jeans and proper work boots. I walked over to meet him. You've traded in the company car then? I've bought this one with cash. You like it? First vehicle I've ever owned, he said, without a single person's help but my own. I reached out and squeezed his shoulder. I'm proud of you, Oliver. He looked away for a moment, eyes bright. I've wanted to hear you say that my whole life. You always could have. Anytime you liked. I know that now. I think I just believed I had to impress you first. You never did. Not once. After lunch, he handed me a small, plainly wrapped parcel. It isn't expensive, he said. It doesn't need to be. Inside was a simple wooden picture frame, holding a photograph of Derek, Oliver, and me standing beside our very first delivery van, almost 30 years earlier. I'd genuinely forgotten the photograph even existed. On the back, in careful handwriting, he'd written, Mum, for years I confused receiving with earning. I thought inheritance would make me a success. You taught me that character comes first, every time. Thank you for loving me enough to finally stop rescuing me. Happy Mother's Day. Over. I read it through twice before I could trust my own voice. Then I hugged my son. Not because everything had simply been forgotten, it hadn't. Not because full trust had entirely returned. Trust, real trust, takes far longer than a single apology. I hugged him because, for the first time in years, I wasn't embracing the man he'd been pretending to be. I was embracing the man he was finally becoming. As the afternoon drifted on, the grandchildren shrieked with laughter under the garden sprinkler while Oliver turned sausages on the barbecue beside me. At one point, he nodded toward the garage. Range Rover still running all right? Runs like a dream, I said. He grinned. Good. I'll buy my own one day. You're welcome to take this one out for a drive sometime, you know. He shook his head, smiling properly now, the way he used to when he was small. No. I'm going to wait. Wait for what? Until I can buy one myself. I laughed so hard I had to wipe tears from my eyes. There he was. My son. Looking back now, people sometimes ask me whether that stolen vehicle report was the worst thing Oliver ever did. It wasn't, not really. The worst thing was believing for years that another person's success could somehow become his own, simply by standing close enough to it. The best thing that came out of all of this wasn't changing my estate plan. It wasn't keeping hold of the car, or being proven right on paper. The best thing was watching my son finally discover that dignity cannot be inherited. It has to be earned, every single time, by the person who wants to keep it. If this story reminds you of somebody you love, or perhaps even a little of yourself, I hope you'll take one thing away from it. Love should always be generous. But it should be wise too. Helping someone is a gift. Preventing them from ever having to grow is not. If this touched you at all, do share it with someone who might need to hear it today. And if stories about family, accountability, and second chances speak to you, I'd be genuinely glad if you'd subscribe and join me for the next one. Until then, take care of the people you love, and never wait until it's too late to finally tell them the truth.